chair in our apartment that comes from my mother's grandparents' house. I think I've got that right. And my mother calls it the Timeout Chair. I'm not sure that was the term in use back then, but it was where you sat if you broke my great-grandma's many rules. So nowadays that chair just sits in our living room and no one calls it the Timeout Chair, really. It's a relic from my mother's childhood, a relic of a parenting technique not in use in our house. Plenty of folks will say that timeouts work and are helpful. Others will say they're not, and I promise I'm not offering any judgment on it. But I knew they weren't going to work for me, at least not when the kids were very young. I don't remember being sent to timeout myself, but I do remember moments of feeling separate and alone and sort of left to sort myself out, not by choice, but by someone else's command. And that did not sit well with me, right? The idea of a timeout at its best is that it separates someone so that they can have a chance to get control of themselves, right? To self-regulate, learn how to do that. That, of course, presupposes that the child knows how to do that, right? Or is experienced enough to do it. And if they are, it's a great way for them to stop their body, recalibrate their behavior, master their emotions so they can re-enter the action safely. But it doesn't always happen that way. And often it can be a punishment rather than an opportunity, right? A banishing away from others. A long time ago when the children were young, like very young, I remember reading that relational pain, so emotional pain as it's created in relationship to others, can have the same effect on the brain as physical pain. That emotional trauma, feelings of loss or abandonment, heartbreak, those can affect our brain in the same way that punches and kicks and broken bones can. And it's really astounding and runs quite contrary to that schoolyard chant, right? The sticks and stones may break my bones. I'm sure you've all heard it. In fact, words can hurt us, actually. Separation can hurt us, being made to feel beyond the circle of companionship, beyond the circle of compassion and care, being made to feel outside and alone, exiled and banished, even for short periods of time. That can cause damage to our brains and our development and can take a physical toll as well. So some folks have articulated an alternative, one that does, I think, what timeouts are actually supposed to do, and it's referred to as time-ins, if you've ever heard of this. The idea is that, yes, you remove a kid from the action, but not to place them alone, you go sit with them, right? Even if it's just to sit quietly with them. You stay with them while they calm down. If it works, you coach them through calming down. And so whether you're a timeout or a time-in person, and in fact, the principle is the same, right? The foundation of the thing is the same. We humans are whole beings, physical, emotional, psychological, and we exist in relationship, always and forever. And so whether you wield that information as a carrot or a stick, being in relationship matters deeply to most humans, though of course we're individuals, so in varying degrees. We forget sometimes as grown-ups that we get to make a lot of choices about how we handle our being in relationship. Most of the time, if we're in a moment of stress or discomfort, we get to choose if we want to separate ourselves or not. Sometimes we want to be alone, sometimes we want to be with people, sometimes we're overwhelmed and want a quiet, dark room, sometimes we want a hug, and most of the time we get to choose. But not always. So I'm going to ask you, only if it feels safe and comfortable, to think about a time when you felt like you wanted to be in company, wanted to be with people, and instead you were left out or left alone. That feeling when you are yearning for companionship and it just isn't there. That feeling of being outside, unchosen, made to stand apart, a stranger in your own life in the moment you are in. I would hazard a guess that every adult on earth has known that feeling at least once. And for many of us, it's probably the closest we'll get to understanding what exile feels like. Of course, some of our human family have a deeper understanding of exile. Some have been exiled from families because of some aspect of our identity or who we chose to marry, the religion we chose to embrace or deny. Some of us might even know what it is to be exiled from our homelands. Exile can take many forms, and it can include a sense of exile from ourselves, from friends and loved ones. And we know that feeling of pain, of intense longing, of sorrow with that shade of anger to it. That feeling that comes when we're denied a sense of belonging, denied a place in the world that we can understand as ours. And if you take that feeling and amplify it over years, you've got a recipe for PTSD and trauma. Amplify it over millennia across generations, and you've got a recipe for collective generational trauma. Imagine that it's not just one little timeout or one party you weren't invited to, but the condition of your whole life. Exile. It's hard to fathom if you haven't experienced it, and yet so many have. Refugees who spent decades or whole lives living in refugee camps, forced from their homes by violence and war. And so many through history have experienced it. Black folks brought to America against their will and enslaved and separated, harmed. The institution of slavery for centuries did everything it could to isolate and exile Black folks from themselves, from their communities in every way possible. LGBTQ folks who have been made through time to conform and thus be exiled from their own truths, hidden, separated. The Jewish people who generation after generation experience prejudice and violence. The Passover story teaches us that there is a path toward liberation if we can stay the course. I don't know how many of you have ever been at a Passover Seder. Some? Okay, many, that's great. At this Passover Seder each year, we tell the story of the Exodus. So in very short, a very short summary of the story of Exodus, the Jews are enslaved in Egypt, and Moses manages to escape the slaying of all the Hebrew sons that are being born. Pharaoh has ordered them all to be killed because he's worried that one will rise up an army against him and free the Israelites. And so Moses manages to escape this and grows up to be an adult, and God calls on Moses. And very long story short, Moses and his brother Aaron manage to free everyone, and off they go, and they wander for 40 years until they make it to the promised land. Okay, it's like shortest telling of the Exodus story ever. Thank you. And every year when we tell that story at the Passover Seder, we're asked to say the words of the story and understand the story as if we too were enslaved in Egypt, like our ancestors so long ago. We're not just telling the story, we're saying, I was there, I was freed. I too know what it's like to be exiled, to be wandering, afraid, but called to hope and to faith. We too know what it is to finally be set free. It's a fascinating demand to place on those of us attending a Seder. On this night, we're not simply telling a story, we are the story. We are in the story, we ourselves, right now. Time is elided, and we are our ancestors, and they are us, and we are the stories that are yet to be told. Tell your children, it says, say it out loud, I was among those brought out of slavery and into freedom. And how much more those words came to mean in the wake of the Holocaust. There is a great power that the Seder recognizes in storytelling, in ritual narrative. It's a way of building not only collective memory, but building community. By narrating historical collective trauma, we also build collective resilience and build a sense of belonging. And I remember, even as a child, hearing that call to know that I was there in Egypt and having that create a sense of kinship with my people. Stories leave a mark. Being part of a group that has been persecuted and telling that story, knowing that among the people killed in pogroms in Russia must surely have been my relatives, knowing that among my ancestral people were those who made their way across the Atlantic looking for a better life, leaving behind friends and family who then were slaughtered, knowing that there are those who would have loved to stay in their homeland, but who came here because they couldn't live their lives if they stayed. That staying would have meant a different kind of exile, hiding themselves, hiding their wholeness. Knowing that I come from a people of exile by choice and by command leaves a mark. I know you've heard me say before that there are studies that suggest that we inherit more than just timeout chairs. Our DNA, it has been proposed and researched, holds markers of trauma long past, and not just our own, but our collective, generational, communal trauma. We inherit it in our bodies. Just as we inherit the stories and the histories, we inherit these things whether we wish to or not. They are part of who we are, the product of generations that have come before. So there are traces, emotional resonances that we then cultivate through narrative. Of course, I wasn't actually enslaved in Egypt and don't really know what that would have been like. And my life is one of relatively great privilege. In the scheme of our world, my experience of oppression is almost non-existent. My life is not under constant threat of danger. And yet, even for all my privilege and safety, I have internalized the story of my people. From my grandfather's family's immigration to the sense of kinship with those murdered in the Holocaust to the frequent reminder that Jewishness is not welcome in many parts of our world and even in many of our own backyards. That trauma of my ancestors has a place in my life, a place carved out by years of telling and retelling the same story of exile, of separation, of loneliness, of heartbreak. We tell stories for so many reasons. We tell them so that memories don't fade. We tell them as if they were happening right now so that we don't forget that indeed they can happen right now. We tell the story to remember that all around the world, folks are made to be strangers in their own lives and in their own lands, are forced out of their homes, made to wander. We tell the story, I think, in part to remember that under every external presentation, whether it's rags or a three-piece suit, under every marker of conforming to the dominant culture, there could be a person experiencing a form of exile, that it could be us. We tell the story to remember that anti-Semitism is alive and well in our world. We tell the story to remember that all of us are just one tyrant, one civil war, one societal breakdown away from great trauma. We forget that. We live into our privilege and we forget that but for our birth, but for the tenuous social contract we agree to, but for the democratic process, however shaky it is at the moment, but for the work of liberation being enacted at great peril by so many, we could be living with the same fear, the same violence, the same horror, the same need to find relief by leaving behind everything we have ever known. We forget how close to the edge we all are. Now, the story is the narrative of a trauma, and it could be, as such, a story that only evokes pain and hardship. A story that's used as a stick, a warning, a punishment. But instead, the night of the Seder is joyful. At our Seder this past Monday, as the 10 of us sat down and I looked around the table at these people that I love, I got a little teary. Those are my people, my smallest and closest community. That's where I belong, where I know myself. My long history back into time, my own individual story, all my possibility for the future. They were good tears, though we were still in the part of the story that is hard. They were still good tears. And that feeling only grew as we reminded each other once more of the climax of the narrative, that we survived. That even as we mourned those who were not able to survive, we rejoice that we, through millennia of oppression and prejudice, have. We rejoice that human grit, human defiance in the face of evil, human resilience is very, very real. And it's built by remembering all the times we've done it before, cultivating not only that collective trauma memory, but the collective memory of hope and possibility. On Passover, you're called to invite folks in to experience the Seder, non-Jews as well. I think perhaps this is not only to tell the story of Judaism to others, but to offer a gift from the wisdom of our people, a reminder that liberation can come if we stay the course and work for it. Very few of us humans escape this life without some sort of trauma, without knowing deep pain, without experiencing exile. And I will note what I'm sure you know, which is that the last 2 years mean that truly none of us have escaped it. We have had our own kind of exile these past 2 years. And I think the best combat we have against evil and violence, against trauma and exile, is proactive community. And it's part of why this, and can I just take a minute and say how nice it is to see so many of you here? It does actually make me a little bit teary. This is the fullest the room's been in the last 2 years. And it is, it makes me want to cry a little bit if I'm honest. But this is part of why small local communities matter so much, because places like this provide the table that we all get to sit around and have a place where we all can belong and tell our stories and remember pain and reconnect to strength. The Seder table is a place of belonging, and so too is this room. We say at the Passover Seder, next year in Jerusalem, but we don't usually mean it literally. We mean next year in a world without the pain of exile. Next year in a world of freedom and liberation. Next year in a world of gentleness. Next year in a world without oppression. Next year where we belong, around a table of beloveds, all the challenge and joy of real community thick around us. Next year, every year, in defiance and in hope, in the cultivation of community. You're here in this space, online, in this community, I think because you know that even when you want to be alone, even when you want to seek meaning in this solitary kind of way, having someone in that time in with you, quietly next to you, matters. You're here because you understand that belonging matters. You're here because you are loved and enough just as you are, and yet hearing a call to still be more and change yourself and change this world inspires you. So the invitation this morning is to let yourself belong and let yourself be inspired. Let yourself be inspired in this springtime season of new growth, of change. Let yourself live into the blessings you have, offering gratitude for them, even as you tell the stories about the hardships of your past and your present. Let the stories of your life and the stories of our shared humanity inspire your determination. May we remember the pain and the scars, the times of exile, and may we speak widely and loudly of the triumphs, the moments of belonging, of liberation. Next year in Jerusalem. So may it be.